I never imagined that house-sitting for a friend could turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. When my cousin Sarah asked if I could look after her late uncle's estate for a weekend, I saw it as a welcome escape, a chance to get away from the city, relax in the country, and earn a little extra cash. I had no idea that beneath the veneer of an old country home lay secrets that would shake me to my core. The drive to the estate took me deep into the countryside, past rolling fields and quiet roads lined with ancient trees. The address was remote, a sprawling Victorian house set on several acres of overgrown land, far from the nearest town. I arrived late in the afternoon as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the property. The house was imposing, and despite its elegant architecture, there was an air of neglect about it. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and the windows were dark, as though the house itself was keeping its secrets hidden. Sarah had told me the place was empty since her uncle passed away unexpectedly several years ago, and she had inherited it along with some of his belongings. I was to feed the cat, water the plants, and ensure the house was secure until Sarah could return. After a brief tour with Sarah on the phone, she explained the basics and insisted that I enjoyed the tranquility of the estate. I stepped inside. The interior was vast, with long corridors and rooms filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. Every surface was draped in dust, and the silence was almost oppressive. I set down my suitcase in the entryway and began to explore, trying to familiarize myself with the labyrinthine layout. I discovered the library first, a grand room lined with towering bookshelves, many of which held faded, leather-bound volumes. A large, ornate desk sat in one corner, and above it hung a portrait of the man who once owned the house. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved about the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I dismissed it as the effect of dim lighting and my overactive imagination. Before retiring for the night, I made sure every door was locked, turned off the main lights, and even double-checked the windows. I left a note for Sarah, promising to call her if anything unusual occurred. The cat, a sleek black feline with bright green eyes, rubbed against my legs as if to say welcome to my home. I settled into the guest bedroom, its antique furniture arranged neatly despite the room's chill. The wallpaper was faded, and the bedspread was a deep burgundy, its patterns nearly indiscernible in the low light. I listened to the silence of the house as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, despite an underlying sense of unease. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to a faint sound, a soft, scraping noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps a loose shutter banging against the wall, but as I lay still, the noise persisted, growing gradually louder and more deliberate, like footsteps pacing outside my door. I sat up, heart pounding in the darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its screen lighting up just enough to reveal the pattern of the room. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the sound itself. I debated whether to investigate, but my rational mind insisted that it was nothing more than the creaks of an old house settling. Reluctantly, I tried to return to sleep, though every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that subtle scratching. When morning finally broke, I forced myself out of bed, feeling exhausted. I made a cup of coffee in the dusty kitchen, where I noticed that one of the cabinet doors was slightly ajar, something I was sure I had closed the night before. I frowned and closed it carefully, wondering if I had simply forgotten or if someone had tampered with it. I called Sarah to report that everything seemed fine, though I hesitated before mentioning the unsettling sounds. Just the usual creaks of an old house, I told her, trying to keep my voice light. Yet, as I walked through the quiet corridors that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found more odd details. A door that wouldn't latch properly, a drawer that was left open. And in the library, I noticed that a book had been moved from its shelf. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to search the house more thoroughly. I retraced my steps from the previous night, checking every room, closet, and corner. Scene 2. The basement. I found nothing amiss at first glance. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dust. But then, in the basement, I discovered something that made my skin crawl. The basement was a cavernous space filled with old furniture, trunks, and boxes that seemed to hold decades of forgotten memories. I was there to check the furnace and ensure that everything was in working order, but as I moved among the stored relics, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was small and unassuming, tucked away behind a stack of old canvases. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, musty odor seeped out. I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside was a narrow, dark room that looked more like a storage closet than a functional part of the house. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, unmarked boxes. I slowly moved between them, scanning for any clues. Then I noticed a box that was different from the others. It was locked, but I could see that something was written on it in faded ink, for the residents' eyes only. My heart pounded as I tried to recall if Sarah had mentioned anything like this. I didn't remember ever hearing about a secret room or hidden documents. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the house been used for something sinister? I pried the box open using a screwdriver I found among the tools on a nearby shelf. Inside, I discovered a collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters. The photographs were black and white, showing various scenes from the early 1900s, the house as it once was, families gathered in what now seemed like a forgotten parlor, and candid shots of people I couldn't recognize. The newspaper clippings detailed strange occurrences, missing persons, unsolved crimes, and local scandals. One clipping mentioned the mysterious disappearance of a young maid who worked at the estate over a century ago. The letters were written in a formal, dated script, hinting at a family feud and secrets that had long been buried. As I sifted through the contents, the scratching sound I had heard the night before echoed in my memory. Was it connected to this hidden room? Had someone been coming here to look for these very clues? The more I read, the more it became apparent that the estate held a history of dark, unexplained events. There were no supernatural explanations here, only human actions and the inevitable decay of time. But the knowledge that these unsolved mysteries were part of the house's legacy made me feel as if I had stepped into a living history of terror. That evening, I felt compelled to lock every door and window once again, and I installed a makeshift barricade on the basement door. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was drawn to that hidden room, that the secrets of the past were calling out to be uncovered. As dusk fell, the house transformed once more. The corridors grew darker, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. I sat in the living room, the flickering light of an old lamp casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. I couldn't focus on a book or the television. My mind was preoccupied with the discovery in the basement. I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting it to open on its own. At around 10:30 p.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and measured, echoing through the hallways. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could explain, the line went dead. I was alone, or so I thought. The footsteps grew louder, and I could now tell they were coming from upstairs. I pressed my ear against the closed door of the hallway, straining to hear any indication of who, or what, was there. The sound paused, and then started again, moving methodically down the corridor toward my room. I was frozen in place, unable to move or call out. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an intruder, a previous resident determined to guard the estate's secrets, or merely the echo of my own imagination? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that an old house, like this, would naturally produce odd noises. But every fiber of my being screamed that something was terribly wrong. I slowly backed away from the door, trying to reach the kitchen where I could secure myself. As I passed the long hallway, I noticed a shadow move at the far end, a silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. My blood ran cold. I clutched my phone tightly, feeling its cool surface under my sweaty fingers, and hurried into the kitchen. I bolted the door behind me and pressed my back against it, listening for any sign of movement. Minutes passed, like hours. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my own rapid breathing. Then, without warning, the front door banged open with a violent force, as if someone had thrown it open from the outside. I cautiously approached the window, peering out into the dark night. The driveway was empty, and there was no sign of anyone near the door. Had it been the wind, or was it a warning? I couldn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the locked door, my mind spiraling with every theory imaginable. The photos, clippings, and letters from the basement haunted me, their cryptic messages urging me to uncover more. I kept thinking about the footsteps upstairs and that fleeting shadow. Could someone be actively searching for those secrets? Had I inadvertently stumbled onto something that someone was desperate to keep hidden? By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes red from lack of sleep. I decided to recheck the basement, hoping that daylight would provide clarity and perhaps calm my growing paranoia. I approached the basement door with trepidation, each step echoing in the quiet hall. I paused before opening the door, taking a deep breath and reminding myself that there was no one else here, only the remnants of the past. I descended the creaky stairs, my flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. The secret room was exactly as I had left it, the locked box open, and its contents spread out on the dusty floor. I gathered the documents carefully, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from the scraps of old history. The letters hinted at a bitter feud within the family, accusations of betrayal, and even suggestions of embezzlement and cover-ups. It was as if the estate itself had been a silent witness to decades of corruption and hidden crimes. As I read, I became aware of a low, almost imperceptible hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but a deeper part of me knew it was something else. The sensation of being watched returned with a vengeance. I could almost feel invisible eyes tracking my every movement, as if the house's past was reaching out from the walls to reclaim its secrets. I left the basement with a growing sense of dread, clutching the documents like a lifeline. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I made phone calls to local historians, and even tried to contact Sarah for more context, but she was unreachable. Her phone switched off. Or perhaps she was away. I began to worry that I might be alone in this discovery. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the property to clear my head. The overgrown garden was silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the cool air. As I walked along the winding path that circled the estate, I noticed fresh footprints near the back door, a door I had assumed was always locked. The prints were shallow, as if someone had been tiptoeing, and they led toward a small, neglected shed on the side of the house. My heart pounded as I approached the shed. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges. Inside, I found nothing unusual at first glance, just old gardening tools and boxes filled with forgotten trinkets. But then I noticed a tattered journal wedged between two crates. The journal belonged to a former caretaker of the estate. His words spoke of strange occurrences, of feeling as though he was constantly being watched, and of odd visitors who came in the dead of night. He wrote about the house's dark history, the secrets of the family that once lived there, and the bitter disputes that had left scars on every room. The final entry was the most disturbing. I fear that I have awakened something that cannot be put back to sleep. The house is alive with its secrets, and I am trapped in a web of my own making. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal. The words resonated with everything I had experienced since arriving. I felt a mounting urgency to uncover the truth, even as a primal part of me urged me to flee. Was it possible that the estate's history was so fraught with malevolence that it had drawn someone, or something, to protect it? That night, I resolved to confront my mounting terror. I spent the late afternoon preparing, gathering all the documents, the journal, and even my camera, hoping to document any further disturbances. I set up my phone in the living room to record the area, and I even rigged a small recorder near the basement door. I needed proof, evidence that I wasn't just imagining these encounters. As dusk fell, the house plunged into darkness once more. I turned on every lamp I could find, creating a patchwork of light in the otherwise oppressive gloom. I settled in the living room, determined to wait out the night and capture whatever might come. Hours passed in a tense silence. I found myself watching the dark corners of the room, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside, made my heart race. Then, at approximately 11:45 p.m., I heard it again, a series of deliberate footsteps on the upstairs corridor. The sound was distinct, echoing off the high ceilings. It wasn't the random groaning of an old house. It was measured and purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight, and after a long moment of hesitation, decided to investigate. I crept up the staircase, each step sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through a narrow window. I moved slowly, listening for any sound that might betray the presence of another person. As I reached the end of the corridor, I paused outside a door that led to one of the guest rooms. The handle was slightly turned, as if someone had just exited. My mind raced. I knew I had locked every door when I arrived, and I had been alone all weekend, or so I thought. I pushed the door open and found the room empty. The bed was unmade, and on the small table by the window lay a single envelope. My name was scrawled across it in spidery handwriting I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message: "Some secrets are best left undisturbed." I stood there, stunned, my heart hammering in my chest. This was no random note. Someone knew about my investigation. Someone was watching me, and they didn't want me prying further. Fear and anger warred within me. I wanted to call out, demand answers, yet every rational thought screamed that I needed to get out of there. I returned to the living room, my mind reeling. I listened intently as the recorder continued to capture the silence of the house. Minutes later, I heard the sound of a door closing gently upstairs, followed by a low murmur. A voice, almost inaudible, reciting words that I couldn't make out. The sound was haunting and deliberate, as if someone was performing a ritual of sorts. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to leave. I gathered my documents, the journal, and the envelope, and made my way to the front door. As I passed through the hall, I heard footsteps again, this time right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing except the long, empty corridor. Panic surged through me, and I bolted out of the house, not daring to look back. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes fixed on the road as I tried to distance myself from the terror of that night. The estate's silhouette receded into the darkness, but its presence lingered in my mind like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. I eventually pulled over at a roadside diner and sat in a booth, still clutching the envelope in my trembling hands. I called Sarah once more, my voice shaky as I recounted the events. This time, she didn't laugh or dismiss my concerns. Instead, she was silent for a long time before finally saying, "I'm coming to get you." I don't know if Sarah truly understood what I had experienced, or if she thought I'd simply overreacted to the isolation and decay of the old estate. But as the first light of dawn broke, I found myself driving back to the property with her by my side. When we arrived, the house looked as it always had, quiet, imposing, and indifferent to the secrets it held. Together, we spoke to local authorities and historians, trying to piece together the mystery that the documents in the journal hinted at. They confirmed that the estate had a troubled past, filled with scandals, bitter feuds, and unresolved disappearances. No one had ever dared to delve too deeply into those matters, and many believed it was best to leave the past alone. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the deliberate footsteps, the whispered words, and the chilling note that warned me off. I returned to my apartment in the city, forever changed by what I had experienced. I kept the envelope and the journal tucked away, as if they were dangerous relics, best not revisited. The recorder's files, which I later reviewed, contained faint sounds that I still can't explain. A soft murmur, a distant creak, and at one point, what sounded unmistakably like a heavy sigh. I shared my story with a few close friends, and while some dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by isolation, others believed me. They told me that old houses have memories, and that sometimes the weight of the past can become almost tangible. I wasn't sure what to believe. All I knew was that I had come face to face with a horror that was all too real, a horror rooted not in ghosts or monsters, but in the dark secrets of human nature and the ruins of a life that had long been forgotten. I never imagined that a simple house-sitting gig could unravel into a terror I'd carry with me for decades. It all started when Mrs. Callahan, a longtime family friend, asked if I could look after her modest suburban home while she attended a conference out of town. I was 22 at the time, young, independent, and eager for a little extra cash. The idea of spending a quiet weekend alone in a well-kept house with only her amiable cat and a few potted plants for company seemed like a dream come true. The house sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else. Its exterior was neat, but unremarkable, a single-story bungalow with wide windows and a well-tended garden. Mrs. Callahan had explained that nothing was out of the ordinary here, but that night, as I parked my car in the driveway and stepped through the front door, I couldn't shake a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Inside, the house was immaculate. I spent the early evening unpacking, familiarizing myself with the layout, and taking care of small tasks, feeding the cat, a portly tabby named Jasper who eyed me with a mix of curiosity and indifference, watering the ferns, and reading over the brief instructions Mrs. Callahan had left me on a handwritten note. I made dinner, a simple pasta dish, and settled onto the living room couch. I remember thinking that the silence was comforting. There was nothing more peaceful than a quiet home at night. I locked the sliding glass door that led to the backyard and checked every window. Everything was as it should be. I then turned on the TV and, feeling a bit drowsy after dinner, allowed sleep to take over. It was around 3:14 a.m. when I was rudely awakened by a faint, irregular click. At first, I assumed it was just the house settling or perhaps the old pipes groaning in the quiet hours. But as I lay in bed, my senses prickled with unease. I could swear I heard a soft scraping near the kitchen. My heart began pounding in my ears. I tossed off the covers and fumbled for the bedside lamp. Every shadow in the darkened room seemed to move, as though I was not alone. I crept toward the hallway, each step measured and hesitant. The corridor was dimly lit by a small nightlight Mrs. Callahan had left in the hallway. As I neared the kitchen, a chilly draft brushed past me. The sliding glass door, which I distinctly remembered having locked, now hung open by an inch, allowing a sliver of the cold night air to invade the warm interior. My mind raced. Had I forgotten to lock it? But I was sure I had checked earlier. I shut the door quickly and secured it once again, my hands trembling as I did so. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, every creak of the old house amplified in the silence. I even tried to convince myself that it was merely my imagination running wild, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't shake the thought that someone might have been inside, slipping in and out when I wasn't paying attention. The rest of the night dragged on painfully slowly. I sat up in bed with the lights on, the knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen resting in my hand, like a feeble shield. I kept my senses alert, straining to catch any sound, any hint that the intruder might return. At one point, I heard what sounded like the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor outside my bedroom. I froze, listening intently. The sound soon faded away, leaving me with a cold sweat and a mind full of terrible possibilities. I couldn't fall back asleep. Every minute felt like an hour, and every noise, whether it was the hum of the refrigerator or the distant rustle of the wind in the trees, became a potential threat. My mind conjured up images of shadowy figures moving silently along the hall, of a pair of eyes watching me from behind the curtains. I kept thinking, what if there's someone in the house? What if they're watching me right now? I eventually forced myself to get up and do a thorough sweep of the house. I started in the living room, checked every door, every closet. I even peeked into the bathrooms, half expecting to find a stranger lurking behind the mirror. Nothing was out of place, except the nagging memory of that open sliding door. I closed and locked it again, but an unsettling chill remained. When dawn finally broke, the first pale light creeping through the curtains did little to ease my anxiety. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and decided that I needed to get to the bottom of this. I called Mrs. Callahan. My voice came out shakier than I intended as I explained what had happened during the night. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "I'm so sorry. You're not the first person to mention this. A few weeks ago, I woke up to find the door ajar. I assumed I'd forgotten to lock it, but I never found anything else unusual." Her words sent another shiver down my spine. If she hadn't taken it seriously then, what if it wasn't a one-time occurrence? I decided to make a call to a neighbor I barely knew, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Peterson, who had lived on the block for over 40 years. When I mentioned the incident, he paused before saying, "I've seen odd things in this neighborhood before. Doors left open when they should be locked. Faint footsteps in the night. Sometimes I wonder if it's just the wind, or if someone's been sneaking around." I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. There was no obvious sign of a break-in. The alarm hadn't gone off. Nothing was missing. But the sense of violation was undeniable. I spent the rest of the day unable to shake my paranoia. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I kept checking the door, double-checking the locks, and wondering if I should leave immediately. Yet, a part of me was determined to wait until Mrs. Callahan's return to explain the situation. After all, I had signed on to house-sit responsibly, didn't I? That afternoon, I decided to search the house for any clues. I began in the living room, where I had spent most of the night. I examined the sliding door more carefully. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock mechanism was intact, and the door's frame bore no marks. However, I noticed a small smudge on the glass, as if someone had pressed a finger against it. I could not tell if it was merely a stray fingerprint or something more deliberate. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I scoured every inch of the house. In the study, I found a family photo on a shelf, a picture of Mrs. Callahan, her husband, and a young girl. I'd seen it before, but today it made me think about the concept of family safety. Had anyone ever intruded into this private space before? The thought was as disturbing as it was inexplicable. I then went to the basement, a place I had initially avoided because of its dark, musty atmosphere. The basement was a clutter of old boxes and furniture draped in dusty sheets. As I walked down the creaky stairs, a sense of foreboding filled me. I turned on the single overhead light and began rummaging through a box labeled miscellaneous. Among old magazines and trinkets, I found a faded envelope addressed simply to the resident. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Not all who enter here leave unchanged." The note was unsigned and undated. My heart pounded as I realized that I couldn't remember seeing this before. Had Mrs. Callahan left it for me? Or was it from a previous occupant? Either way, its presence made my skin crawl. By early evening, my nerves were completely frayed. I tried to distract myself by reading on the couch, but every time I heard a creak or a distant sound, my eyes darted to the door or window. I turned the lights on full blast in every room, and even left the interior doors open, as if to let in some normalcy. Yet, the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house persisted. I ended up sitting in the living room with the television on, barely paying attention to the show, and a knife hidden under a cushion. I rehearsed scenarios in my mind. What if someone returned? What if I heard footsteps again? I would confront them, I told myself, even if my voice trembled. I promised myself that no matter what happened, I wouldn't let fear control me. Then, just as I was starting to doze off in a fitful rest, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate thump came from upstairs, different from the earlier sounds in the kitchen. My blood ran cold. I sat bolt upright. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the staircase, every step echoing in the stillness of the house. At the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. There was silence, but then a soft shuffle. I moved toward the master bedroom, heart hammering in my chest. I pushed the door open and was greeted by darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the early morning light seeping through the I called out, "Hello," but only my echo replied. Then I heard a faint sound coming from the closet. I inched closer and pulled the door open. Nothing. I stepped back, mind racing with possibilities. Had someone been hiding here the whole time? Had they slipped into my safe haven while I slept? My rational mind told me that perhaps I was simply imagining things, that the stress had taken its toll. Yet the evidence, the open door, the mysterious note, the unexplainable noises, suggested otherwise. At the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. There was silence, but then a soft shuffle. I moved toward the master bedroom, heart hammering in my chest. I pushed the door open and was greeted by darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the early morning light seeping through the I called out, "Hello," but only my echo replied. Then I heard a faint sound coming from the closet. I inched closer and pulled the door open. Nothing. I stepped back, mind racing with possibilities. Had someone been hiding here the whole time? Had they slipped into my safe haven while I slept? My rational mind told me that perhaps I was simply imagining things, that the stress had taken its toll. Yet the evidence, the open door, the mysterious note, the unexplainable noises, suggested otherwise. I retreated to the living room, determined to call Mrs. Callahan again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. When she picked up, I stuttered, "There's something in the house. I think someone's been here." Her voice was soft, but laced with regret. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I wish I'd been here. I'll be back tomorrow. Just try to stay safe." I hung up, feeling more alone than ever. That night, I barely slept at all. Every creak and whisper in the darkness sent me into a new spiral of panic. I kept checking the locks and watching the door, but nothing else occurred. It was as if the intruder had vanished, after leaving a trail of unsettling clues behind. When Mrs. Callahan finally returned the following day, she was visibly shaken by my account of the previous night. The police were called, and an investigation ensued. They searched every inch of the house, from the attic to the basement, but found no sign of an intruder. No fingerprints, no footprints, only that single, inexplicable smudge on the glass and the faded note in the basement. In the weeks that followed, I found it impossible to put the experience behind me. I began noticing small things in my own apartment that mirrored that night. The subtle creak of floorboards at odd hours, the sensation of being watched when I was alone. I even found myself double-checking locks and windows long after I'd returned to my regular life. Friends told me it was paranoia, a trick of an overactive imagination fueled by one traumatic night. But I knew what I'd experienced was all too real. To this day, I still wonder whether someone had been living in that house all along, a silent observer who knew the rhythm of the building, slipping in and out, undetected. I wonder if that person had ever intended to do more than merely unsettle a house sitter. Perhaps they'd been waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. The house-sitting nightmare left me with a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes, the most dangerous intrusions aren't about theft or violence. They are the slow, creeping violations of privacy that leave your mind haunted by endless what-ifs. I now sleep with the lights on and a constant awareness that in any place you call safe, there may be secrets lurking in the shadows. Even now, I catch myself glancing toward doors and windows when I'm alone. I remember that cold night, the sound of an open door that shouldn't have been open, and the desperate feeling of being trapped in a home that wasn't really mine at all. And every time I do, the horror of that weekend rushes back, an everlasting reminder that sometimes the true nightmare is not what you see in the dark, but what hides just beyond it.